Okay, whoops. Vermont history students, hello. And welcome to the video for Unit 9 of the 12 that we're going to have all semester long. And so, we're really getting close to the end of the semester. 2/3 of the way done already. And so Unit 10, which will cover Wednesday and Thursday, goes up to about 1970. It goes from the end of World War II to 1970, which is really, that date is around the time of Act 250, which is a massive comprehensive land use act that's still rather controversial in Vermont, but is the culmination really of the previous 80 years of people trying in Vermont to tangle with the implications of preserving the state, but yet also allowing for a growth and trying to find that perfect balance. So Unit 9 leads up to that by covering the years of the Depression. Now, before I get to it, just as far as housekeeping goes, I'm looking forward to a lot of people's second assessment papers rolling in right about now. Would be a great time for it, and I'll get them right back to you. Let's keep the momentum going on town meeting. We have a town meeting, of course, that is just wrapping up right now, and let's keep those going because they've been so great all semester and are such a good learning tool. And I just want to remind you again that if you end up taking it incomplete in the course, it's going to be a long-term incomplete because I'm rolling out of here on a 5-week camping trip the day after the semester, the course ends, which is July 2nd. So please just get everything done on time and we'll be good to go, okay? Alright, so this unit, this class, is really dominated by this massive figure whose name was George Aiken. And you need to understand Aiken to understand 20th century and 21st century Vermont. He is a pivotal figure in Vermont, to say the least. Aiken became governor in 1937, elected in 36. And when he took over, Vermont was grappling with a huge host of problems as it attempted to negotiate change that was really necessary, but nevertheless was difficult for people. The change, you can date it beginning in 1927 with the massive flood. Vermont experienced an enormous flood in 1927 that really damaged, destroyed a lot of the Vermont sort of transportation infrastructure and had an enormous impact on the economy. And you can read about that in the textbook. But Vermont had always prided itself on being a state that paid as it went and that had local control and that didn't accept outside money. But the flood of 27 required that for Vermont to rebuild, it took money from the federal government. And that's sort of like now Vermont is really changing, and it was really hard for people. But there's longer term and larger changes going on, to say the least, that make it so that Vermont's economy is being reoriented, and Vermonters have to adjust to that. The most important industry in the state, of course, is dairy farming, and the peak number of farms in Vermont was in the 1880 census at about 33,000. And it was gradually going down after that. It accelerates and going down to a great extent in the 1920s. During the Depression, the number of people on farms actually went up because, at least on farms, there's plenty of work to do and plenty to eat. But the long-term trend is certainly away from smaller, well-tilled dairy farms. And as far as the existing farms that still lasted they tended to become larger, more consolidated, and more efficient. Also, the foundation of the traditional Vermont economy was also weakened and on its way out. And what you're talking about is like extractive industries, like quarrying, timber, things like that. Traditional industries like textiles, paper making, and hi, here's the cat. Remember him at the beginning of the semester? He was a lot smaller. But the whole foundation of the traditional economy, in a lot of ways, industrial economy, was weakening, and it had weakened in the 1920s before the Depression, and certainly went down during it. There are other challenges that Vermont faces, modern problems, and one of the things that I have on the internet in order to, on the unit folder, to illustrate the modern problems that Vermont faced was the Rutland Marble Strike in 1935 and 36, which was a really nasty strike. It was one of those really horrible, bad industrial disputes. The company, the Vermont Marble Company, was owned by the Proctor family, which was a powerful family in Vermont. On the other side were workers from a variety of ethnicities, Italian, Irish, Polish, and a lot of the strike revolved around, they went out on strike in 1935 when their wages were cut. A lot of the strike revolved around the question of, were the workers Vermonters? Many of them, of course, born in Rutland, some third generation at this point, but their Vermonter status was in dispute, and there's certainly a lot of privileges associated with having the designation Vermonter. It means that you have a right to take place in the long-term discourse about what Vermont was and what it is and what it should be. And the strike gained a lot of national attention. There were a lot of writers from like New York City who had summer homes in the Rutland area who were really shocked that there's this horrible strike going on in this paradise they thought of. So you can look through that folder and get a sense of that strike. And it's right about on the aftermath of that strike that George Aiken got elected governor. Now, Aiken was a son of a farmer and a farmer himself from Putney, Vermont, down in the southeastern corner of the state. He began after a while in the 1920s having a seed business. He would sell wildflower seeds and other seeds. And he became widely known across the state because of this. He also wrote some books, pioneering with wildflowers. And the cool thing about it is that Aiken, through his seed business, was one of those guys like Justin Morrill, a century before, who when uphillers looked at him, they saw him as an uphiller, and downhillers looked at him, they saw him as a businessman, a downhiller. So he's able to negotiate that line, walk that line in between. His rise in politics was meteoric. He went from being elected to the state legislature to being the Speaker of the House, to being lieutenant governor, and then to being governor, all in the space of 8 years. And when he took over, and he is a big exception, I mean, your traditional governor is a railroad lawyer or something like that. When Aiken took over, he began to do things that governors hadn't done in the past. Most importantly, right after he became governor, he attended a labor banquet. He attended a banquet that the American Federation of Labor had thrown in St. Johnsbury, and people were shocked, because no governor had ever attended a organized labor banquet. Traditionally, Vermont's political structure was pretty hostile to organized labor. And Aiken's message was, you're Vermonters just as much as anyone else. You have a right to this state. Another thing that he did was he went into he got the state government to investigate why the granite sheds in Barre were so unhealthy, and the problem was a lack of ventilation with the pneumatic drills that were cutting them. So he had the state install ventilation, and a lot of the health problems in the Barre granite industry began to get better. So he's cool that way. He started always talking about a working partnership between farmers and industrial workers, and went to farmers and said, unions are just like cooperatives. You have milk cooperatives, they have unions. They do the same thing. And he actually brokered this really nice, cooperative, friendly relationship between the head of the Farm Bureau, Arthur Packard, and the head of the largest union in the state, the Allied Stone Product Workers Union, the Barre Granite Workers Union, and their leader was John Lawson. And began to form all of these coalitions and partnerships, and always talking about, and it was really cool that way. And so as the late 30s went on, there was all this social ferment that went in the direction of negotiating the change that needed to be done because of the Depression and much longer term changes, but doing it specifically in a Vermont way. Aiken, one of the things, like a good illustration, is that during the Rutland strike, the state had spent $50,000 on armed guards to put down the strike. When Aiken was governor, he used to say $50,000 was too much money, so he would get the head of a union and the representative from management, and he'd take them to the State House and take them into his office, and then he'd say, we're not leaving until we solve this strike. And then he would come out and say, the two of them worked out the strike problem themselves, and this strike was solved in a Vermont way with no government interference, which was kind of true, but also completely not true. But he's constantly talking about doing things in a Vermont way, trying to translate the values of a small Vermont village in, the 19th century to address the biggest problems that Vermont faced. Among the things, of course, that he had negotiated was the growth of the federal government, the New Deal, And he was very careful about picking and choosing the programs that he liked, like rural electrification, Social Security, and embracing those kind of quietly, but then vocally, loudly objecting to programs that he didn't like the people who lived on submarginal lands being replaced and some flooding bills and things like this. He was, a guy who was helping Vermont negotiate change in a way that change didn't cancel out tradition, but actually that tradition was used in order to negotiate the change in a way that tradition became more important than ever. And it's a beautiful thing that way. So George Aiken is the man. And then World War II came along, and Aiken went to the Senate, where the United States Senate, where he served for forever, eons. And meanwhile, Vermont's left to sort of figure it out. And the World War II is a huge turning point as far as the term Vermonter goes. I mean, after people of French Canadian and Irish heritage go off and defeat Nazism, it's very crass to say they're not real Vermonters. And so by the time you get to where the next unit starts, by the end of World War II, Vermont has a language and a set of values that it can apply to how it's going to negotiate the next great change that it has to face, which is going to be the construction of the interstate highway system. And there's before and after the interstate highways. The highways put Vermont within a day's driving distance of